So LUMIX S1RII has arrived. It kind of pushes the boundaries of what's possible in relatively budget full-frame mirrorless bodies. And it has the ability to shoot stunning 8K video. It can capture silky smooth 4K at 120 frames per second. Like, this camera is built for average shooters. It's great for filmmakers, photographers, content creators, people who are just looking for high resolution and high frame rate capabilities. But with any camera, it's not without its quirks. You know, it has a fairly slow readout sensor, which means rolling shutter might be a concern. Dynamic range is kind of decent, but not quite industry leading. So I don't know, I'm torn. But the biggest thing is the price. LUMIX always gives us incredible value for their bodies. So is the LUMIX S1RII the camera that's going to be in your toolkit, or some of these limitations are going to be holding you back from purchasing this camera? That's what we're going to be finding out. So let's get it. So the LUMIX S1RII is Panasonic's newest hybrid beast. It is a 44.3 megapixel sensor. It has a dual native ISO and Vlog at 200 and 1000. It does 8 stops of IBIS. It is the new phase detection autofocus. It can do 10 frames per second with 12-bit stills, or 9 frames per second with 14-bit stills in mechanical shutter, and 40 frames per second in electronic shutter. It uses the same DMW BLK22 battery. It has a 5.76 million dot EVF. It has the new 1.84 million dot multi-angle flip screen. It has the shutter protection when you turn it off. You can record externally with an SSD, or internally with the CF Express Type B, or one SD card slot. It weighs in at a total of 795 grams, which is lighter than the S1, and the current price at the release is 5,499 Australian dollars. Now, you must take the price into massive consideration when we talk about the specs, because this body offers a lot of value compared to the competitors. So I do have to mention as well that LUMIX did send this pre-production copy to me. It is pre-production firmware, so things may change. I definitely don't get to keep this camera. They don't get to have an input or get to see this before you guys. So I do have to send it back. Unfortunately, I would love to keep this thing, but I don't get to keep it. But this is a nice video for you guys to see if it's going to be worth it for you guys. So now I know we've got a lot to get through in this video, and I'm going to try and compress it as much as I can. Now, I know there's going to be a lot of people making a very similar video to this, but in my experience, I'm in Australia as well, and I do a lot of sports action. So hopefully this will offer slightly different to what you're going to be seeing. There's going to be a lot of people going over to Norway using this camera in beautiful situations. Not me, I'm down here in hot Australia, and they're in beautiful, nice, chilly Norway. Usually I sweat as much as this, but I've got a lighter rig, so I shouldn't be sweating too much, but it is really hot today. 32 degrees, 31 degrees, so yeah, it's hot, but that's a standard. I'm getting to work out at the same time. So, 44 megapixel sensor. They've opted for that relatively, I suppose, mid-range resolution. Just, you know, if they went like the higher 60 megapixel sensor, you're going to have a slower readout sensor, so it's going to be way worse when it comes to videos and rolling shutter performance. So they've opted for that 44 megapixels, which I think is a smart choice, because rolling shutter performance, we'll talk about later, isn't incredible, but still this is going to give us, you know, 4K at 120 frames per second. And when it comes to stills, you've got 10 frames mechanical shutter or 40 frames in electronic shutter. So that's pretty decent. But obviously with electronic shutter, you're going to get rolling shutter artifacts because you're not using that mechanical shutter. So, you know, 10 frames is pretty average, but 44 megapixels is nice and high and sort of crisp sort of resolution. Now, also when it comes to this sensor, we do have a low base in Vlog at ISO 200. And then when you switch it over to the high base, you have an ISO level at 1000. So 200 and 1000 for your dual base ISO levels. And we also have the new feature Dynamic Range Expansion, which is in Log. This is a pretty incredible feature which actually gives you almost a whole stop extra in dynamic range, but at the cost of a little bit slower readout and more rolling shutter artifacts, but we'll talk a little bit more about this later. So I've taken the liberty to create a full video specifications list here. You can see it's pretty extensive to what you can do inside this camera. It can pretty much do 8.1K up to 30 frames per second. You've got 6.4K at open gate 3x2, and you can do cinema 4K up to 120 frames per second. Now, at the time of the release of this camera, there will be a firmware update that you can do open gate at 8K. And if you're someone that still likes using HD, well, this is the recording formats you can use. And this is the ProRes format. You have 5.7K at 25 frames per second or 30 frames per second in ProRes HQ, which is 3.5 gigabits per second. Pretty massive file size. And you can see the rest of the formats on this chart. Now, this is a quick video of the crops you actually get in the respected frame rates, and you can see, most importantly, 8K is full frame. You've got 5.8K that's full frame. Cinema 4K at 50 frames per second is pretty much full frame, just a very slight crop. And Cinema 4K at 100 frames per second happens to have a very small crop as well. Now we've got to talk about the image quality, the 8K, the 6K open gate, the 4K at 120 frames per second, which is a bit of a game changer for some people because I know a lot of people were asking for full frame 4K 120 frames per second. And I am doing a future video that I'm going to be putting it up against the S5 IIX because I own the S5 IIX and I want to know if I'm going to be purchasing this and kind of, you know, making the S5 IIX a B camera when I use my LUMIX cameras. Not 100% sure yet because some of the results are interesting, but when it comes to 4K 100 or 120 frames per second, the image quality is pretty damn good, and it is really good to have 4K at 120 frames per second because, you know, we are limited to 1080p at 120 frames per second with the S5 IIX, and now 4K 120 is kind of like the industry standard with a lot of mirrorless cameras. Now the 8K is the interesting thing because when you actually look at the 8K image and compare it to the 6K open gate, I mean, it is so similar. It's on my screen, it's literally like splitting hairs. It is really hard to tell the difference. And if you really think about it, the vertical resolution is pretty much the same. It's just that horizontal resolution, you get an extra 2K, but 6K versus 8K really isn't too much of a difference. Now, I also do have to mention that at the moment, this copy doesn't have OpenGate 8K, but there will be a future firmware that LUMIX told me that there is going to be 8K OpenGate on this thing. Now, some people are going to be a little bit annoyed that there isn't any 8K 60 frames per second. Now, I know some people really want 8K 60. I honestly don't know who wants to use 8K 60. 8K 25 for me, or 8K 30 or 24 is perfectly fine. And not to mention they do actually offer 5.9K at 50 or 60 frames per second, which I personally do feel like is definitely enough. And it obviously is far superior than the previous gen where you had that Super 35 crop, but you still had 4K. And honestly, in my opinion, looking at these images side by side with the S5 IIX and obviously the competitors as well, this 5.9K is more than enough. I feel like the 6K sort of region is the sweet spot at the moment. 8K seems to be a little bit overkill in terms of, you know, size of the file. This just seems to hit that sweet spot. It's better than the 4K 50. I just think it's perfectly fine. For me, now this is just for me, but I love using 25 frames per second in most of the modes. Slow motion is kind of like a thing I use rarely. Like there are only a few different shots that I actually require some nice slow motion, but a really nice high quality 25 frames per second for me definitely goes a long way. But I know there's going to be a lot of people that will be like, oh, why don't we have OpenGate slow motion, or why don't we have 8K slow motion? Unfortunately, at the moment, 8K 25 or 30 frames per second or 24, and then OpenGate 6K at 25, 30 or 24 frames per second. Now, let's talk about dynamic range. This could be a little bit of a caveat. So they've tried to make the sensor a little bit faster, but sacrificing a little bit of dynamic range. And look, when it comes to the rolling shutter performance, it's not amazing. It's very similar to the S5 IIX. Some situations when you actually use the high dynamic range mode, it's actually worse than the S5 IIX. And you actually get similar amounts of dynamic range. So it's an interesting sensor. And I know there are some people that may not like it. When it comes to my workflow, like I do a lot of action sports. I don't really notice too many artifacts when it comes to rolling shutter performance. Like with this one, in the couple of sports one that I did, I actually intentionally wanted to do a whole bunch of fast whipping motions. I still didn't feel like rolling shutter was an issue for me, that it was noticeable enough to really be an issue. But the dynamic range, I just wish it was a little bit more. It's not necessarily groundbreaking when it comes to current modern cameras. And when we're talking about this dynamic range, it's about 14 stops when you actually turn on the dynamic range expansion mode. And if you turn that off, it's about 13 stops. So it's about a stop difference. And in comparison, the S5 IIX is about 14 plus stops. So with the extended dynamic range, it's about the same as the S5 IIX, but the rolling shutter is slightly worse. But if you turn that mode off in most of the recording frame rates, the rolling shutter is about the same as the S5 IIX, but about a stop less dynamic range. And just to compare it to a faster reading sensor like the Sony A7S III, you can see here that there is significant rolling shutter differences. The A7S III, FX3, ZV-E1, FX6 sensor ends up being about 8.7 milliseconds. If I were to put a number on the S1RII without knowing this, it would be something like 22 to 23 milliseconds in terms of the rolling shutter performance. Look, I don't know. Let me know in the comments below if this is going to be a bit of an issue for you guys. Like, it really does depend on your workflow, what you do for your work, but will it be an issue or will it not? Pretty interested to hear your thoughts. One thing I do have to mention when it comes to this image quality against the LUMIX S5 IIX is the noise performance. It does seem like this S1RII has a better, cleaner sensor. The noise is more finer, there's less compression artifacts, so I feel like it just handles the codec and handles the image a lot better. But in saying that, this is absolutely pixel peeping and bringing up the shadows. Also, you do actually have the new CineLike A2 LUT. So this is pretty incredible. It's pretty much like a ready to go picture profile that you don't actually have to grade over the top. You can tweak it little bits and pieces here and there in terms of the color or the saturation, maybe a little bit of contrast. It's purely up to you, but it's meant to be designed so you can pretty much just give it to the client and you're good to go. So this CineLike A2 mode is actually really nice. I love the tone that actually comes out of it. It, you know, picks up the blues very well, picks up the greens, but I'm not really sure how much dynamic range difference you get out of this one compared to Vlog. Generally, Vlog will give you more dynamic range, but one of the things is with Vlog, you can use that extended dynamic range mode, whereas with CineLike A2, you cannot use that extended mode. So now another issue that I kind of had was the stabilization. Now, this was interesting. It just really wasn't working for me. There was one shot that I had in mind for this shoot that I really wanted to do, and that was a very, very slow push in with the talent literally sitting there. He's backlit, there's some nice sun rays. You could imagine the vision that I sort of had. You know, you had the haze make the sun rays pop a little bit, and trying to push in, I don't know. It just wasn't working. I have no idea why it wasn't working. I went through a whole bunch of different modes. I had regular stabilization on, I had electronic stabilization at the highest, and when I was trying to walk forward and back, it wasn't doing it for me. It was quite shaky. Now this was at 50 millimeters, and with the active stabilization, the digital stabilization on top, it crops in quite significantly, and I don't know, it kind of made it like a 75 mil focal length, so it was pretty tight, but still, it really just didn't dial it in. I don't know why. I'm going to do more testing with this because I know LUMIX have incredible stabilization. I just don't know why it wasn't working very well for me. And I even had it in 8K, and I was like, maybe it's just the resolution. Maybe I'll go open gate 6K. So I did that, and it was pretty much the same. And you can see I actually cycled through the digital stabilization modes. I initially had it on high, so it crops in a lot, but it stabilizes it so much more. But in my case, it didn't. So I went to a lower cropless stabilization, which is the new one, and it didn't work again. So I have no idea what was going on this whole shoot. And you can see here, this is with IBIS and digital stabilization on high, so it should be perfectly stable, but it just wasn't. And I'm glad I actually screen recorded this so I could send it to LUMIX so they could figure it out. Now, I do have to preface again that this is a pre-production copy, so the firmware isn't 110%. But the annoying thing is I cannot replicate this post shoot. Like, it only happened on that shoot and I cannot replicate it again. I thought maybe it's because I had the Ninja 5 sort of connected to, and I was recording in that, but I was recording internally at the same time. And I thought maybe it was just the HDMI issue, but I cannot replicate the same issue. So when you guys get your copy, you won't have these issues. I guarantee that 110%, because LUMIX pretty much have the best stabilization in the business. It just was a shame that I couldn't get that shot, but it is what it is. So the LUMIX S1RII reportedly has 8 stops of IBIS, whereas the LUMIX S52X has 5 stops of IBIS. Let me know if you can see a massive difference between the two. Now, one of the biggest things that I absolutely love about this, and you guys will love too, is the full ergonomics. They've taken literally like the S52X's playbook and the whole body and literally just thrown the new sensor in it and a whole bunch of cool features. And you're gonna love this thing. This is actually recessed. So if you guys have the S52X or know that this is on the edge on the S52X, and sometimes you accidentally hit that shutter speed and you're changing the shutter speed. So what I've had to do on the S52X is incrementally change the shutter speed. So if you actually hit that dial, it just literally goes up by 1 degree. So it's 180, then it goes 181, 182, so on and so forth, just in case I do actually hit it. And I do actually hit it quite a lot more than I actually thought. But this one is kind of recessed into the body and I haven't had any issues. But they've actually added this lock right here that you can pretty much choose specific dials to lock, or you can just lock them all, which is so good. And it's one of those features that a lot of people have been asking for, and they've just delivered on it, which is, you know, typical LUMIX style. They literally give you everything that you're asking for. Also, when it comes to the ergonomic design, this is it's so good. The varying axis screen. So this is going to be great for videographers, for photographers, literally everyone who doesn't like just the flip screen and everyone who doesn't just like that little flip up screen. This gives the best of everything. So it is so good that they actually added this to the body, and it doesn't actually seem to be too much thicker than the S52X as well. So they've somehow kept it quite compact and given us this incredible screen. So I'm so impressed with that. Now, one feature that they did take from the GH7 is obviously the red record button on the left-hand side. Love it on the left-hand side. I hate the ones on the right-hand side. My Red Komodo X actually had it on the right-hand side, and I actually hold the handle on the right hand, and my left hand is generally on the base of the lens. So, you know, having it on the left-hand side suits my workflow so much better, but having that record button on the front is so good because you got one on the front, you got one on the top, but you could also program it in one on the back if you really wanted to as well. So you can see here I've actually got this cinema rig right here. I've got the Rigid Pro back, and I've actually fit this directly to the LUMIX S52X cage. Like, it seems to be almost the same size. So it fits directly on the cage. I was able to put the cage in this Cineback because this whole rig feels way more comfortable for me, especially when it comes to the sports shoots, because I undersling quite a lot and make the athletes powerful, so I shoot up. But yeah, such a good form factor and size. Now, one major thing that I love seeing is that hybrid switch. Now, I am used to this on the Sony cameras. You do have the photo, video, and SNQ mode, and this one, all you need to do is switch it in and all your settings are saved, which is great. And I love that when it comes to hybrid shooting. But there is one thing I did run into when it came to one of my CrossFit shoots, that when I actually took a whole bunch of photos and I was kind of spraying and praying and just getting a whole bunch of different shots, and then I switched it back into video, it was buffering. So I did run into a few issues where it was like 16 or 17 seconds. I had to wait until it sort of cleared that buffer. Then I could start recording my video. But the card So just for reference, this is the card that I'm using. It's a pro grade card. It's 650 gigabytes. So you've got 1700 megabytes read speed and you've got 1500 megabytes of write speed. You would think that it's enough for this CF Express Type B card, but that buffering issue was there. Not sure if this is going to be changing in future software or firmware updates, because I do have to preface again that this is a loaner copy and it is pre-production. So the firmware has actually changed a couple of times since I've actually used this, and I have updated to the most recent firmware, but it could change in the future. And we know, typical LUMIX style, they do give us a whole bunch of different firmware updates in the future, which is great.
Right, so with the autofocus mode, I've got it into full area. Wasn't exactly catching on him. I tried zone, which just puts a little box in the center, but because Isaac's sort of doing the muscle up, he's going in and out of frame. Not exactly working, so I tried human tracking. Similar thing, it just didn't want to catch focus. All right, yeah, when you're ready. But yeah, Isaac's gonna hate me because we're gonna be doing it once more again, and I might just throw in some manual focus just with this one because I'm not doing too much movement, so yeah.
So one of the limitations that I did find was the autofocus system. Now I am very, very blessed and used to the Sony autofocus system. That is pretty much incredible when it comes to fast-paced action sports that I do. Like if I am doing some CrossFit stuff, I want it to be, you know, tackling the autofocus like no other. I need it to be sticking to the athlete, or if I'm using manual focus lenses, then obviously I don't have to worry about it. So I've used the S1RII on a few shoots now, and there's just been a few situations where the autofocus just hasn't hit the spot. Like I am going in between different autofocus modes, subject tracking, wide autofocus, zonal, but it's so difficult, mainly for the fact that when you are filming, you know, sports, action stuff, that the athlete isn't going to be directly in center frame the whole time. So there's so much going on, and sure, it is a very difficult situation, but majority of the time, the Sony FX6, the Sony FX30, ZV-E1 handles it perfectly fine in my situations. But not to say that the LUMIX S1RII is bad when it comes to the autofocus, it's just not at that level yet. Okay, just a bit of an update. This is the second firmware update they've sent me now. So I'm gonna be doing a firmware update to hopefully fix this autofocus issues, because other people have been getting these issues. So great that LUMIX are really onto it and trying to push out the best firmware possible, but it is so close to release time. And I know there's a lot of people like me that have pretty much completed the video and done all the testing, and now I have to do a little bit more testing. Like, I'm not getting paid for this. I didn't get sent to an exotic location. They literally just sent me the camera, and I feel like I don't have to put in so much effort into this video, but for you guys, I want to put the effort in so I make the best video possible so you guys can make the best decision possible if you're going to be adding this to your kit. So we'll do a little bit more autofocus testing in this video. Now, I understand this might be a very difficult situation to be in because it's a high contrast situation, but if my Sony cameras can handle it, so can the LUMIX S1RII. So this is pretty much the situation I was having. It was right here, it was focusing on my shoulder, wasn't focusing on my face. Sometimes it was coming to the background. So hopefully this time it's going to be focusing on my face this time. Now that actually seemed like it worked. So I've got it in CineLike A2, which is their new picture profile, which actually I really like this picture profile. There is just something to it. It's just enough where it's almost like a Rec 709 conversion with a little bit of extra sauce. It's pretty cool. But hopefully the autofocus is going to be working this time in this high contrast situation. So it does seem like the autofocus is so much better after that firmware update. Look, I don't have time and I don't have extra money to put towards another shoot. Like I said, this is not a paid review, so I cannot put any more resources into another shoot. And obviously this video drops in maybe 5 or so days. I'm actually going away to a funeral down in Victoria, so I'm pretty much away from my studio for the next 4 days, so I don't have time to organize anything else. But it seems like the autofocus is so much more responsive. Yeah, so well done to Lumix for fixing these issues. So hopefully you guys will be getting a camera with much better autofocus performance like this.
So the S1RII Mark II has a 44 megapixel sensor, and I'm actually taking some stills. I'm doing RAW plus JPEG because I'm not sure if I can edit the RAW photos yet because it's obviously an unreleased camera. But 44 megapixel stills is going to be really nice high resolution photos. Isaac's going to love that. So yeah, we're going to get some cool stills.
So 44 megapixels is pretty high resolution. It's not necessarily low, it's not necessarily crazy high. It's kind of in that midpoint, very similar to say like the A7C Mark II or the A7 IV, where it has a 33 megapixel sensor. This is 44. It's just enough where the file sizes aren't crazy big, but they're not obviously that small where you can't crop in. So I feel like the images are perfectly fine. So that yellow flashing thing right there.
So I've got this little marker on the screen. I think it's like an overheating warning, and obviously I haven't dealt with that before, so I think, oh, here you go, thermal management, onto high.
And yeah, I did experience overheating, but obviously this isn't going to be an issue because there is a fan in here, so you've got active cooling, which is going to cool it down. Now, I am in really hot Australian summer, and especially with this CrossFit box, it's literally just a shed. I had to turn all the fans off just so that the mist, the haze wasn't going to be blowing around and completely dissipating too fast, so it was hot. And this thing was starting to give me overheating signs, but I was like, what? There's a fan. Surely this can't overheat. But obviously I went into the settings and I was like, oh, okay, well, it's on standard. I turned the overheating temp to high, and then I guess 5 minutes later, it cooled itself down. But you just have to take that into consideration. I know Sony cameras, when you turn it on, it'll actually tell you, hey, do you want to turn your overheating temp to high? And you can either say yes or no right from the start. But in saying that, it's a test unit, and this one had already been opened, and I'm not sure if Lumix actually do offer that. Let me know in the comments below, but just be aware that you do have to turn that overheating temp to high, and you'll have no issues whatsoever. So getting overheating warnings again, not even recording, and internal body temp is on high, screen's flipped out, but I might try and flip it out a bit more like this. So yeah, it overheated on me. Wasn't even recording, it was just sort of sitting in the sun. But I don't know, this is interesting. Now I can't press anything. Okay, yeah, back, cancel. Let's turn it off and turn it back on. Then we see what we got. No, I'm getting the same overheating warning. What's going on? Now, there is one thing that I did find as well, and I think this will actually be updated in a firmware update. I have actually told Lumix this, but when you hit the record button, you actually have a very, very slight delay. And I did compare this against the LUMIX S1RII, and what I actually did is I used 3 different memory cards. So I used a CF Express Type B Pro Grade card, then I actually used a Sony Tough card, and then I also used a Lexa card as well, just to see if it was the card, but all consistent results, about 6 to 10 frames that I was missing on the S1R2 videos compared to the LUMIX S1RII. So there does seem to be an internal issue here that would most likely be fixed in a firmware update. So I was just watching a lot of the edit, and I feel like I've gone in really harsh on this camera, but there's so much to love about this thing, and there's so much I haven't covered as well, like false color. There is false color in this, and I love exposing with false color, but I only have the ability to do false color through external monitors. I don't think any other camera manufacturer does false color. Maybe the Canon cinema cameras, not 100% sure, but That's a pretty incredible feature that I love when it comes to exposing. Now you also had that 32-bit float integration into this camera with that DMW XLR2 with that top audio device that you plug directly into the hot shoe. So that's really cool that they actually added this in. They did that first with the GH7, but it's great that you added it in this camera. Now another small feature that is very welcomed is obviously tally lights. Now tally lights are pretty much just red LED lights that just lets you know that you're recording. You can actually turn them off as well in the settings, or turn specific ones off, which is really good to customize that. I don't think the Sony cameras allow that, so it's great that LUMIX does that. Now in conclusion, this camera is pretty incredible. Obviously there are a few of those pre-production bugs, but that will be sorted out obviously in regular copies when you guys get yours. This is a fantastic camera. I mean, 4K 120 frames per second, 5.9K at 60 frames per second, you got 8K and then 8K open gate eventually when this gets dropped. It's just a phenomenal camera. It's obviously better than my S5 IIX, and I really feel like I need to add this into my kit. Like, it's just at that right price point where I feel like you're getting so much value for the price, and the image quality obviously is phenomenal. And look, I just love it overall, and if I do end up having a few extra dollars, I most likely will pick one up. But thanks for watching this whole long video, and stay tuned for that LUMIX S5 IIX versus the S1RII video. And yeah, I'll see you guys in the next one. Let's get it.